So, in addition to the different roles in the university that I fulfill as part of the University Writing Center and with the English department, I also want to talk a bit about my general pedagogical approach. My background is in critical pedagogy, which focuses on students as being sources of knowledge in the classroom, soliciting active engagement with them, and working on problems in the classroom with them. So, that informs my approach to generative AI. I'm going to start my talk with my first known encounter with students submitting for use of Gen AI work, which was my English 220 course, Graphic Novels, which I taught in the spring of 2024. And some of the major takeaways I had as I formulated my response to this mid semester intrusion. Being a doctor, not a detective, figure it out with your students, not for them. Know your students, know your enemy. They're not the same, just to clarify, and some low stakes writing exercises that I felt were helpful in cultivating my response to AI and helping them feel confident in how to use it, and then some takeaways from that experience. So, I was kind of spoiled in 2023 in that I normally teach upper division rhetoric courses. These classes are smaller typically, and they're mostly English majors. So people who had cultivated writing skills pre AI, who saw themselves very much as writers and bought into the idea of these skills are valuable to cultivate on your own without taking shortcuts. And because I saw a lot of their writing throughout the semester, I didn't detect any unusual papers or anything like that. By contrast, English 220 is the largest course I've taught, 35 students, probably not so big for some of you. Um, and it was almost entirely non-English majors. And because it was a 200 level course on graphic novels, a lot of my students figured it was going to be much easier than it was. We're just looking at, superheroes and picture books, and it turned out to be more complicated than that. The reason why I bring that up is because I think that it informed their expectations and may have led to some people being tempted to use Gen AI when things got difficult. So, some basic things about my pedagogical approach that reflect critical pedagogy. I don't do a lot of lecture normally. Class is discussion based. Um, they share their opinions with each other and with me. They submit questions every class that I then cover for the next class. So, our schedule is very much driven by what they want to know. And because it's a small enough size, I can get away with that. And I saw a lot of their writing in class, so nothing came up there. But when the first major paper was submitted and I went through everything, I started noticing some odd signs. The syntax and grammar were better. They were dropping terms like socio-political, which we had never discussed in the class, but not following up with any kind of definition or sourcing for that. There was way less engagement with quotes compared to the work I'd been having them do. The analysis was weaker, and the paragraphs were just kind of bland. And so I ran my prompt through a couple of Gen AI platforms, and I got very similar results. And so this was my initial reaction. I was not prepared to deal with that. I knew that there was no foolproof way to detect the use of AI. And so I felt kind of at a loss. If I felt a little bit disempowered as an instructor, to be honest. Um, and mainly, I was thinking, however I handle this, I don't want to damage the rapport I have with my students because I can't verify anything. I don't want to um, ruin the work I've put in terms of building trust and engagement because if they feel like I don't trust them, they're going to be less engaged. They're not going to come to me if they have any issues with their writing. And so I wanted to find a way to kind of work around that and not put too much pressure on myself to try and do something or respond in a way that I couldn't really follow up on. So this led to my first revelation on the subject, which is be a doctor, not a detective. I thought about why do I do what I do? And the answer to that is I want to help students become better writers in whatever context they find themselves in. And if AI is part of that context now, then that's how it is. My goal is not to catch and punish cheating. That's not fruitful for me. It's not fruitful for them. I also realized that even if the technology has changed, the traditional reasons why students plagiarize are still valid. They're pressured, they're overwhelmed by everything going on in their lives, they might just be nervous about their abilities. And so, what I had to do from there, which is admittedly difficult for me sometimes, accept what I couldn't control, admit what I don't know, and confront those limits and confront them publicly with my students for reasons that I'll explain. My experience with teaching has taught me that the relationships you've cultivated in your classroom will be your fallback for any perceived crisis. Anytime a class is not going according to plan or some new variable enters the chat, like AI, what you want to do is be able to discuss that with them and think about, well, this didn't go as planned. This was unexpected. Where do we go from here? And as I thought about it more, I realized I didn't figure out the students were using AI because the papers were brilliant, with great source engagement, great organization, anything like that. I caught on because things were not as good as what they were doing on their own in some cases. And so I realized that if a student uses AI poorly, it's going to result in a poorly written paper. So odds are they're not going to really get away with anything, whether or not I can prove they used AI. And so from there, that led to my next point, which is figure it out with your students, not for them. So I talked about AI in general terms like, hey, as I was going through the papers, I noticed some differences in the type of writing style I've been encountering. And I ran my assignments through some Gen AI platforms, and I think this might be the reason. So that gets beyond accusations or investigations. It's more like, here's what I found, and then just kind of use it to launch a larger discussion. I talked about how I can see why you would want to engage with this technology. It's something that you're going to be dealing with later on in your lives. And so that tells me that I need to help you learn how to use it effectively. And that's what's more important right now. So what I did was for the second paper, or if they rewrote their first paper, they had to attach a log of how they used AI, where they used it, and so on. And I didn't penalize anyone who used it initially without disclosing it. Um, and that led to my discussion of how this AI might be used beyond the class. So overall, I want to kind of distill those points. I think it's important to be transparent and generous with your thinking, no matter what your AI policy is. Again, you can't stop them from using it, but you can show them respect by explaining your reasoning with them and tying it to what's going to benefit them, even if you decide you don't want to use it in your class. I went out of my way to frame myself as a co-learner of how Gen AI works. It's still a fairly new technology. I couldn't have claimed to be an expert then. And so I just framed it as I want to learn more about this so that I can help students in the future. I don't want you to be penalized because I don't know how to handle this right now. So I want to collect data from you and we can work together and figure out how to use this productively. And I think you'll get something out of it too if we do it that way. That's a core tenet of critical pedagogy that I can't be the best teacher I can be without talking to you and hearing your feedback. This is a collaboration. And whenever I talked about reservations about using AI, because there are some things to consider, I framed it in terms of how it might impact the students later. The major things I told them were if you just outsource your writing process to a Gen AI platform, you're going to sound like everybody else who does that. You're going to lose your voice. And that's something that matters to most writers. The other thing I said was if you do that and your employer or people in your field catch on, their first thought is going to be, well, what do I need you for if I can just do this myself, if it's instantaneous? So I really wanted to emphasize to get the most out of using Gen AI platforms, you need to know how to write to begin with. And that was where I started to develop my modeling exercises. So initially, I asked them what Gen AI platforms they used, and I started playing with them on my own time. I think another reason why I was overwhelmed at first is because I had never used the technology myself, and so I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what it was capable of, what it could and couldn't do. So you want to demystify. If your students know something that you don't, then it's always important to kind of get caught up to speed on that. And like I mentioned earlier, if this is now part of the student's learning context, that makes it relevant for us to know. That's always been true, and it's true now. As I learned to engage with it, I started focusing on smaller components of the writing process and modeling what I got in class. I would do it at home first, bring it in and say, I asked it to outline paper one. Here's what it gave me. Now, I think this is pretty useful. This part I think needs a little bit more engagement and so on. And just kind of creating room to discuss it in front of them. I had them do it on their own and submit their results to me for that day's participation. So here are some things I found rather about Gen AI strengths and weaknesses at time of recording. I think it's really good at just pure summary, just distilling information without any analysis or interpretation. I think it's really good for generating counterpoints. They may not be the most well constructed, but if your students are making a claim about something, it's good to just say, how would someone respond to this from the opposing point of view? And they can use that to generate responses to those counter arguments. They're also good for what Anne Lamott refers to as shitty first drafts. I believe that's the technical term. To just get through that initial writer's block. Getting started is usually the hardest part of the writing process. So if a student can type something in and just here's what I'm thinking, get the AI to put something out there, and then they can revise that and build on that, I think that's really valuable. It's also really good for dealing with overly long thesis statements or topic sentences. I showed them here, I wrote a thesis argument for a paper for the graphic novel course that's 4 sentences long. I asked ChatGPT to put it down to 1. It did that. It didn't do it in a way that I thought covered all the important information. So I'd be like, add this, and so on. And so the students got to see how my thinking in my own writing process and how I incorporated AI in more successfully. Lastly, I think Gen AI platforms are good for giving layman's definitions of academic terms. So say your students are reading an article on Foucault and they want to know how he's using the term spectacle. ChatGPT can give you a functional definition of that and help clarify that concept. Now, what Gen AI is not as good at are the more creative parts of the writing process. And that's usually involves combining things or arranging them. So with source integration, it takes a lot of creativity to read an article in depth, find a quote that's particularly useful for what you want to say, and then put it in the paper strategically, unpack it in a way that's helpful to the reader. When ChatGPT picks quotes, if it bothers to use them at all, it will just throw it in there and then not really follow up with any detailed exposition. It was one of the ways I could tell something was up. Then comparing and synthesizing text, it takes creativity to figure out how 2 pieces of work that are superficially different might come together. So the final paper in that class was comparing a theme and how it was dealt with in 2 novels. I was looking for things like the line work in novel A renders violence in a way that's comparable to the paneling in novel B. ChatGPT didn't really do a good job of that sort of thing. It would just kind of talk about both novels independently and then say, even though these 2 are very different, they're both really good. Playing it safe a little bit. So similarly, the transitions and interparagraph organization were also very lacking. ChatGPT will give you blurbs about each subpoint that are functional, but there's no real sense of they put the strongest point first, or this point might need 2 paragraphs to develop properly, or this point builds off this point. So again, you want to get your students to think about that. The other thing is conclusions. The conclusions that ChatGPT tends to generate are more summaries and not really adding more to what's been covered. A good conclusion in a paper should talk about should address why did I just read that? What am I supposed to do with this information? And that's a more creative process. One thing I tell them is that AI is not going to recognize the sum of parts for the whole the way people do. The analogy I use is if I tell you I need eggs, flour, milk, butter, frosting, you know we're going to bake a cake. ChatGPT doesn't work like that. It's not going to know what all of that is for. until it's done. And then there's not going to be any real thought into that. So what I did, the other half of that is, it was important for me to know how Gen AI platforms write, but I also need to know how my students write in order to figure out whether or not they're using it or using it inappropriately. So if you're able to do it, it's helpful to incorporate a lot of low stakes and or in-class writing. I know some of you teach online asynchronously or you have larger class sizes. So I try to do this in a way where I'm not reading everything carefully and leaving a ton of comments and grading. It's more about getting a sense of whether or not they're on track. It's building my familiarity with their voices as writers. It's giving them chances to practice the concepts and skills they'll be applying in the major papers so they build that confidence, so they're not tempted to fall back on Gen AI inappropriately. And sometimes I will have them draft components of major assignments in class together or for homework so that they already have something to go off of and they don't have to outsource all of that and they can revise it. Another thing I try to do is take attendance with class activities on Canvas where they take notes, turn in their writing on Canvas for attendance and a completion grade. It's how I take student questions and reflections on the day's activities. If you have a larger class size, you might look for trends in the kind of questions that are being asked or the observations that they're having and respond to those and maybe leave room for people to contact you via email. And then again, continuing to build rapport by responding to what they're doing. Students always appreciate and note in my evaluations when I respond to what they've written because it makes it feel like it was worth doing. Another thing I do with the homework is that, like I said, ChatGPT and other Gen AI platforms are not as good with unpacking quotes in depth. So instead of asking them to summarize what they've read, which you can outsource to AI pretty easily, have them find the quotes that they feel are the most important, which is more active reading, and then engage with those directly. That's something they could apply to the papers, and it's something that ChatGPT is not as good at. So you're teaching them how to read with more purpose and engage with directly with sources, which they can then transfer over. So as far as how this worked in my class last spring, I had some students let me know independently that they appreciated my candor. When you don't talk about something with students, they just assume they're not supposed to do it. And so they're going to try and hide it from you if they do. I found that while some were using AI already, most had not before. So it's kind of overinflated again. I was just, caught off guard. But they were curious to try it and they wanted some guidance on how to do it appropriately. I did also find that students who used AI properly disclosed the use, but students who used it improperly still did not discuss it with me. But because I had laid out some kind of policy, I had more wiggle room where I could say, it looks like you may have used AI here. Here's what I would do to improve the writing versus you shouldn't have done this and now you're going to lose points. So I didn't have to bring it up in a way that was accusatory or definitive. I will say that the policy was likely less effective because I brought it in mid-semester. You might have had some students who were like, is this a trap? So this time around, I'm bringing it in at the beginning. I haven't collected major papers yet, but I've been modeling it in my classes, and I'm hoping that this will bear more fruit in the future. Again, I want to thank you all for your time. We'll go to Q&A now, but if you want some teaching materials from me or the slides, you're more than welcome to contact me.
Thank you, Dr. McKinney. Any question or thoughts?
Hey there, I'll jump in and say, by the way, I'm Nancy Vasquez. I'm the executive director of the University Writing Center. And I'm just going to plug the fact that Matt's actually going to be doing, along with the Writing Center, a longer workshop on this topic later in October. So we'll be sending that out through the WNC course listserv. So just another opportunity to hear and share with more instructors too about what they're doing with AI. But yeah, I think, what you're saying, Matt, really reminds me that I feel like this issue has brought up for me again the idea that so much of the way to address this is to go back to some of the core principles of what we already know makes for good teaching, in terms of just, anything you can do to let students know that you're willing to learn alongside them, that you're willing to hear them and treat them respectfully. I just think it creates an atmosphere where there's a lot more opportunity for discussion. And I'd also say that the one thing, I've seen too is if an instructor completely doesn't mention AI or seems not very knowledgeable about it, I feel like that opens an opportunity for students to feel more comfortable thinking, oh, I can use this in nefarious ways and get away with it. Whereas if they know that you're at least conversant in the fact that this exists and some of the pitfalls in that, I think you're on a better footing to begin with.
That's really true, and thank you for the plug, Nancy.
Sure.
Any other questions or thoughts?
I was wondering, what do you do with the unrepentant students who keep using AI poorly and not disclosing it? Like, what is the point where you do have to report that or deal with that in some way?
So it hasn't gotten there yet, thankfully, but because the paper itself isn't good, I just, they're not going to get the outcome that they're hoping for by outsourcing it. So I just say, like, if you want to go over the paper in more detail, we can set up a meeting and talk about this more in depth. I do let them rewrite the first paper for a major grade. I had a student who tried to use ChatGPT for it. And so I just had a larger conversation about why this wasn't working well. And they met with me and they were willing to fix it. Again, I think they were mostly just kind of scared and they were looking to knock it out and not spend as much time on it. Ironically, they wound up spending more time because they did that. But at least in English, plagiarism usually doesn't get as serious as that. When you're dealing with something like original research in another field, I think that's when it's more consequential.
Thanks.
Hi, my name's Sarah. I work in the School of Public Health, and I'm also an instructional associate professor, so I'm a teaching prof like you. Couple of questions, and you don't have to answer these. One, I'm assuming you have complete academic autonomy and freedom. We do as well.
Mhm.
But discussing how you're allowing students to use ChatGPT, especially within the context of English, has that been perceived as a good or a bad thing among your colleagues? Is something that you discussed with anyone? Because at least my personal feeling, the vibe I get from my department is that they would not be super pumped about letting students use ChatGPT. And you kind of made the comment as well that we do a lot of like research focus based of analyzing. And so ChatGPT could almost write that immediately for someone. So those are my concerns, kind of sort of is how are others around you perceiving its use? And where does that line get drawn of like, this is a practical application, which is helping students with first drafts and understanding the material, and when does it go too far?
That's a great question. My department has been pretty progressive with their response. We have Jason Kreider and Andrew Pilch, who is our associate head. They're both specializing in digital rhetoric, and so they put out syllabus statements for professors, one for people who don't want to use AI and for people who do. There hasn't been a whole lot of concern except for letting students know, like, don't put a lot of personal information into these platforms. Or original research, I could imagine, because ChatGPT, I think there's some copyright issues with that. So those are the big reservations there. So breach of privacy and loss of ownership of data. And then, of course, there is the issue of ChatGPT will sometimes fabricate sources. It's not as dire with English papers usually, but something like medical research, I could see that being pretty consequential. I modeled that for them as well, where I had ChatGPT compare one of the graphic novels in my class and a song, and it just assumed that both were books. And so then I had to be like, that second one was actually music. And they're like, oh, never mind. Here's another comparison. So it's very confident in the way it expresses its points. And I think that can throw some students off. Oh, thank you for the resource, Nancy. Did that answer your question, Sarah?
Yes, I think I'm just, the more I go into CTEs about AI and how to use generative AI, the more comfortable I feel using it. Because like you, I can tell when they use it because they'll throw out words that we've never talked about before. And I think you said socio-political or something like that. You'd be surprised. So I work within health behavior. And so we do a lot about like, what are social determinants of health and the impacts and things like that. And so they'll start throwing out words that I've never taught before in like intro level courses. And I'm like, but do you know what that actually means? So you're right. For me, I can tell when they're starting to kind of pop in and use something that I'm like, I'm not sure if this is your voice or your writing. I'm like you, non-confrontational on the subject. And I just kind of reiterate like, this should be your own original thought. Cause then it kind of toes the line between that and plagiarism.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the whole idea. It's that they're writing their work and they're coming up with original thoughts, and that's what they're getting credit for, not for using generative AI. And so I think that's kind of where I'm trying to find that balance. I'm not there yet. So I really appreciate talks and lectures like these where I can get other people's perspectives and learn more about how you're using it and how it's working for you in a classroom.
Good, I'm glad. And yeah, I mean, I'm with you. Like, I don't have so much free time that I'm just happy to grade papers that a machine put together.
Yeah.
So I definitely don't want to do that.
Yeah.
Any other question or thoughts from anyone? No. In that case, thank you, Dr. McKinney, for coming in and talking to us. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we will see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you for inviting me.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Bye-bye.